You have no idea who you're talking to." Judge Desmond Kessler's voice cracked through the courtroom like a whip, bouncing off the limestone walls and rattling the brass fixtures above the jury box. "I could have you removed in handcuffs before you finish that sentence." The woman at the witness stand did not move. She let the silence stretch a beat, longer than was comfortable, then leaned toward the microphone, her voice low and even, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. Your Honor, the question is whether you remember who I am." For one suspended second, the gavel hung motionless in Kessler's fist. The color drained from his face so completely that the court reporter, 20 feet away, would later say he looked like a man watching his own casket being lowered. The Ironwood Federal Building rose 9 stories above downtown Denver. A slab of glass and red sandstone meant to look like permanence itself. Inside its marble corridors, junior attorneys lowered their eyes when Desmond Kessler passed, and bailiffs straightened their spines without being asked. He was 63 years old, with a head of silver hair kept immaculate by a barber who worked out of a back room with blacked-out windows and 3 governor's numbers in his phone. His suits cut by a tailor who flew in twice a year from Lisbon hung beneath his judicial robes like a second, more honest skin. On his right pinky sat a gold signet ring engraved with his own initials. The kind of detail a man wears when he spent decades making sure everyone notices him first and judges him never. They called him the Undertaker. Not because he was cruel, though he was. Because no one who came before his bench left with hope. What the marble corridors didn't know what the governors, the Bar Association, the glowing profile in the state magazine never printed was that Desmond Kessler had not earned a single inch of his rise. He had been bought, slowly and completely, over 17 years, by a network of corrupt contractors, county officials, and a quiet criminal operation, known in whispered shorthand as the Halverson Outfit, in exchange for buried wiretaps, conveniently lost evidence, and rulings that always seemed to break the same direction. Kessler's name had been added to accounts in Liechtenstein that grew fatter every year. He owned a sprawling property called Cedar Hollow, gated and silent, and a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the foothills of the Rockies, the mountains turning gold every evening as if applauding him. He believed, with the particular arrogance of men who have never been caught, that he was untouchable. On a humid Thursday afternoon in early September, Courtroom 6B was packed for the preliminary hearing in a corporate fraud case involving Solstice Grain Exports on paper, an agricultural export firm, in practice, a laundering pipeline for the Halverson outfit's dirtiest money. The defense table was occupied by a sharp-suited attorney named Foster, flanked by an associate, both of them carrying briefcases that had cost more than $11,000 apiece, and the easy, unbothered posture of men who already knew how the day would end. Across from them, Prosecutor Patrick Soto sat alone, his tie slightly crooked, dark circles under his eyes, from 3 weeks of paper trails that kept evaporating the moment he got close. Kessler had already decided how the hearing would go. He would sustain the defense's objections on the warrant. He would strike the financial records on a manufactured technicality. He would dismiss the case for insufficient evidence. The same flawless choreography he'd performed a dozen times before for the same clients. "Mr. Soto," Kessler said, voice dripping with theatrical fatigue. "Please tell me you have something more than the conjecture you wasted my afternoon with yesterday." Soto straightened. "Your Honor, we've brought in an independent forensic investigator. She's traced the missing Solstice funds to a network of shell accounts." Kessler suppressed a smirk. He'd dismantled forensic auditors before, twisted their jargon until juries went numb. "Very well. Call your witness and let's get this over with." The prosecution calls Vivian Marsh. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a low groan. Kessler didn't look up right away. He was adjusting the ring on his finger, but the sound of her heels on the floor deliberate and unhurried. Sent an inexplicable chill crawling up the back of his neck. She walked the center aisle like she owned the building. Deep burgundy suit. Sharp cut and severe. Dark hair in a sleek, chin-length bob that left nothing of her face hidden. No briefcase. No notes. Just a flat black folder under one arm and a pair of nearly black eyes locked, unblinking. On the bench, Kessler glanced up, registering at first only a striking, composed woman, of the kind he usually respected on sight. Then she raised her right hand to take the oath, and the overhead light caught her face at an angle that made his stomach drop through the floor. He knew that jaw. He knew that stare. He had seen it 17 years ago, in a cold courthouse hallway. On a 12-year-old girl he had walked straight past. Do you swear to tell the truth? The whole truth. And nothing but the truth, I do. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which made it worse. She sat, adjusted the microphone, and did not look at the prosecutor or the defense table. She looked only at Kessler, and something in her expression, patient, almost pitying, told him she had been waiting a very long time for this exact chair. Kessler's hands began to shake. He pressed them flat against the mahogany to hide it. A bead of sweat slid from his temple into his collar. Vivian Marsh, Edwin Marsh's daughter, the ghost of a man he had buried quite literally to build the life he was now sitting in the wreckage of. 2. Marsh, Soto said, oblivious to the silent collapse happening a few feet to his left. Could you state your credentials for the record? I hold a doctorate in financial forensics from Georgetown University, completed with highest honors. I spent 6 years with the Treasury Department's Financial Intelligence Division before joining the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. My work focuses on offshore laundering structures, shell network analysis, and institutional corruption. Every syllable landed on Kessler like a nail driven into soft wood. The oil-painted portraits of past judges lining the courtroom walls seemed to stare down at him with new interest. He reached for the water glass beside his gavel and thought better of it. His hand would betray him. And regarding the Solstice grain exports matter, Soto continued, gaining confidence. What did your audit uncover? Objection. Foster was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, this witness was added to the docket without proper notice. The defense has had no opportunity to review her methodology. This is an ambush. It was, Kessler knew, the perfect escape. Sustain it. Strike her testimony. Clear the room under the guise of procedure. He opened his mouth to do exactly that and found, when Vivian's eyes met his again, that his throat had simply stopped working. She wasn't watching him. She was reading him, peeling back 17 years of polish to the rot underneath. Her expression dared him. Hide behind the gavel. See if it saves you this time. The objection is his voice came out thin. Rede. Nothing like the booming instrument that had silenced rooms for 2 decades. The court reporter's fingers actually paused over her keys. He cleared his throat violently and tried again. Overruled. The witness may proceed. Foster sat down slowly, exchanging a baffled look with his co-counsel. Kessler never ruled against the Halverson outfit's interests. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, and neither of them understood what. Thank you, Your Honor, Vivian said, the courtesy landing like an insult. My audit found that Solstice Grain Exports has no real employees, no actual export contracts, and no physical inventory. It exists solely to launder funds. What's more interesting is where that clean money went next. A significant portion didn't return to street-level operations. Tens of millions of dollars were funneled into the blind trusts of select public officials. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters in the back row sat up like dogs catching a scent. Kessler gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles went white. He was staring. He realized, directly at the consequence of a decision he'd made on a freezing night 17 years ago, when he had still been an ambitious young prosecutor with everything to gain and a quiet, decent man's life standing in his way. Back then, Desmond Kessler had not yet been a judge. He'd been a hungry assistant district attorney chasing the case that would make his career the collapse of a regional teachers' retirement trust. Nearly $58 million drained from the pensions of school teachers across the county. The public wanted blood. The press camped outside his office, and the men actually responsible, county contractors, and a handful of officials tied to the Halverson outfit, needed someone else's neck on the chopping block. They found him in Edwin Marsh. Edwin was the trust's senior accountant. A quiet man who wore the same brown cardigan every winter and genuinely cared about the retirees whose pensions he managed. He was the one who'd found the discrepancies in the first place, believing in the system. He'd carried 2 battered file boxes of original ledgers straight to Kessler's office, certain that the truth, once seen, would protect him. Kessler remembered the smell of cheap coffee on Edwin's breath, the firm, grateful handshake, the promise man to man that he'd be protected. That same night, Kessler fed every page of Edwin's real ledgers into a shredder, with money and forged paperwork supplied by the men backing him. He built an airtight false trail, fabricated wire transfers. Dummy accounts opened in Edwin's name and pinned the entire $58 million on the accountant who had trusted him. The trial was a massacre. Kessler painted Edwin as a calculating thief who'd robbed teachers of their retirements. Edwin, bewildered and betrayed, begged the jury through tears to believe him, looking at Kessler with an expression that still, on bad nights, found its way into Kessler's dreams. The jury convicted him on every count. Kessler pushed for the maximum. Edwin Marsh was sentenced to 28 years at Ridgeview Federal Penitentiary. 5 months in, he was killed with a shard of broken glass in the prison chow hall. Officially, a random altercation. Unofficially, a loose end. Tied off for $20,000, paid to a guard who agreed to leave the room, unsupervised, for 11 minutes. The day of the conviction, Kessler had walked out of the courthouse, already tasting his next promotion, and run straight into Edwin's wife, sobbing on her knees in the hallway. And Edwin's daughter, 12 years old, standing perfectly still in the middle of the corridor. She hadn't screamed. She had simply looked up at him with flat, dry, ancient eyes and said, "You lied. You killed him. I'm going to remember everything about you." He'd scoffed, brushed past her, and gone out for steak. He had spent 17 years and several offshore accounts trying to forget that sentence. He had never once succeeded. "Ms. Marsh," Soto said, voice rising with energy now, sensing the shift in the room. "Can you name the public officials who received these laundered funds?" Objection. Relevance. Foster was nearly shouting now, his chair clattering backward. "This is an unrelated fishing expedition meant to poison the jury pool." Kessler's heart slammed against his ribs. He had to stop this. Hold her in contempt. Clear the room. Anything. He raised the gavel. His hand shook so badly it rattled against the sounding block. "I," the word lodged in his throat like broken glass. Vivian turned her head, and her eyes pinned him in place more effectively than any bailiff could have. "Do it," her gaze said. "Tuli." The gallery was full of press from every outlet in the state. If he, a sitting federal judge, visibly buried testimony connecting a known laundering front to corrupt officials, the headlines alone would trigger an inquiry. He was trapped, and she had built the trap with surgical patience. "Overruled," he croaked. "The witness will answer." "Thank you, Your Honor." She drew a slate blue ledger, bound in canvas, from inside her jacket. Kessler's breath caught audibly. It looked exactly, painfully, like the ones her father used to carry. "I obtained unredacted bank records under international subpoena from Hallcrest Private Bank in Luxembourg. The Solstice funds were routed through a shell entity called Briarstone Capital. The sole beneficiary of Briarstone Capital has received approximately $27 million in untraceable offshore payments over the last 12 years. And who is that beneficiary? Soto asked. Vivian didn't look at him. She turned her entire body toward the bench. And the silence that followed felt like a held breath the whole room shared. The beneficiary, she said, is sitting in front of me right now. The Honorable Judge Desmond Kessler. The courtroom detonated. Reporters scrambled over the benches, dialing editors before they'd even stood up fully. Foster and his associate were on their feet, shouting objections that no one was listening to. Soto stood frozen, his mouth open, realizing his own witness had just dropped a bomb on the man presiding over the case. Order Kessler's voice cracked into something close to a scream. He slammed the gavel down again and again, the sound like gunshots, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. Order in this court, I will hold every one of you in contempt. The noise dimmed to an electric hum, but every eye in the room stayed locked on him. The man who had spent 2 decades terrifying everyone who entered his courtroom now looked, for the first time, genuinely afraid. How dare you? Hey, he said, pointing a trembling finger at her. You walk into my courtroom and make slanderous, baseless accusations, bailiff. Take this woman into custody. The bailiff, a heavy-set man who'd worked Kessler's courtroom for over a decade, took one uncertain step forward and stopped, caught between the order he'd sworn to follow and the accusation he'd just heard from a credentialed federal investigator. They aren't baseless, Vivian said, dropping the title entirely now. And I'm not in contempt. I'm executing a federal warrant. Warrant. You have no jurisdiction in my courtroom. I am a sitting federal judge. I have immunity. Account number 73, Lambda. She continued, ignoring him completely, tracing a line in the ledger with one finger. Opened at Hallcrest Private Bank in the first week of April. 17 years ago, 2 days after you sent an innocent man to Ridgeview to die. The opening deposit was $850,000. That was the price of your soul, wasn't it? Kessler sagged back into his chair, the last of his resistance draining out of him. The exact date, the exact account. She didn't have suspicions. She had everything. You see, Vivian said, rising and stepping down into the well of the court, ignoring the defense attorney's sputtering objections entirely. When you sent my father to that prison, you thought you'd buried a problem. You only planted a seed. I spent 17 years studying. I went to Georgetown. I joined the Department of Justice specifically to find the rot underneath this system. And I started with you. This is a vendetta, Kessler shouted, his voice cracking into a whine. A grieving, unstable woman's personal vendetta. It's inadmissible fruit of a poisoned tree. It's a verified federal audit, she said, voice cutting clean through his. And your books are catastrophically unbalanced. Every bribe you took to bury a Halverson case, every payment that renovated Cedar Hollow, it's all here. She slammed the ledger onto the prosecutor's table. Racketeering, wire fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to commit murder. Murder. Soto finally found his voice, his face pale. My father didn't die in a random fight. Vivian walked up to the elevated bench, forcing Kessler to look down at her, even as the power in the room flipped entirely. You paid a guard $20,000 from an offshore account to leave the chow hall unsupervised for 11 minutes. So he'd never live to file an appeal that exposed your forged documents. I tracked that guard down. He took a federal plea deal early this morning. He gave you up. Desmond, he gave us everything. Kessler couldn't breathe. The walls of his kingdom were coming down around him in real time, and there was nowhere left to run. The back doors opened again. A dozen agents in dark tactical jackets flooded in, fanning across the exits with quiet efficiency. The lead agent walked straight down the aisle and stopped in front of the bench. Judge Desmond Kessler. You're under arrest for racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Edwin Marsh. We have a warrant to freeze your accounts and remand you into federal custody without bail. You can't arrest me in my own courtroom. Kessler was on his feet, his chair crashing backward. I have immunity. I demand to call the Attorney General. The Attorney General signed the warrant, Vivian said quietly from the floor. He looked down at her, and for the first time in his life, felt something close to real terror. In her face, he saw the 12-year-old girl from the hallway, standing over the wreckage of everything he'd built. Hands behind your back, the agent ordered. Two officers gripped his arms, not gently, not with the deference usually shown to a man of his station, and the click of the cuffs closing around his wrists echoed through the courtroom like the final strike of a gavel he'd never get to swing again. You ruined my life, Kessler hissed as they marched him down from the bench. I balanced the ledger, Vivian said, stepping aside to let them pass. You built a mansion on my father's grave. Desmond, I just brought the wrecking ball. Camera flashes exploded as they walked him through the gallery, his robes tangling awkwardly around his legs. Vivian stood perfectly still, watching him go. She didn't smile. There was no triumph in her face, only a deep, settling stillness. 17 years of weight finally lifting from her shoulders. Court's adjourned, she said softly. To no one in particular. And the empty bench behind her. The fall of Desmond Kessler dominated headlines for half a year. Reporters dismantled every detail of the life he'd built on stolen money. Cedar Hollow, the Rockies View penthouse, the offshore accounts in Liechtenstein, the Halvorsen outfit. Recognizing him instantly as a liability, abandoned him entirely, taking their lawyers and their money with them. He was tried by an overworked public defender who barely concealed his contempt for the man he'd been assigned to represent. Vivian sat in the front row of the gallery every day of the trial. She didn't need to testify again. Her 400-page forensic report and the flip testimony of a guard and two officials were more than enough. She simply watched, quiet and still. As the system finally did what it should have done 17 years earlier, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all charges after barely 3 hours. Kessler sat slumped at the defense table, hollowed out. Within months, his silver hair had gone fully white. The judge who sentenced him, a younger colleague Kessler had once humiliated and passed over, showed him exactly as much mercy as he'd once shown the people who stood before his own bench. None. He was sent to Ridgeview Federal Penitentiary, the same facility where Edwin Marsh had died because no other secure facility in the region could safely house a man with his history. The iron doors slammed shut behind him, and the inmates, recognizing the undertaker the moment word reached the block, began beating their cups against the bars in welcome. Miles away, in a quiet office on the 9th floor of a federal building with a view of the Rockies foothills, Vivian Marsh closed a heavy file folder marked Closed Kessler and slid it into a locked drawer. The city looked cleaner that afternoon. Somehow, the shadows a little less sharp. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her father's old fountain pen, the one he'd used to fill those original ledgers 17 years ago. The one piece of him the state had finally returned. She turned it over once in her fingers, feeling the worn brass clip beneath her thumb, and walked out into the afternoon light.